As Derek said, my name is Don Snodgrass. I am a teacher at Canisius and Medaille College. I'm a graduate of Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and I have been learning and teaching and writing about the Bible for many years. This evening, we're going to take our first look at this series, Prophets and Protest. And we're really going to be looking over this next 3 Wednesdays at some of the ways in which biblical prophet stories kind of connect with some of our current issues. This evening, we'll be looking specifically at the Exodus story. And then over the next 2 Wednesdays, we'll be looking at other stories from the Old Testament period. Our series begins about 3,500 years ago in Egypt, here in North Africa. Egypt was described by the ancient Greek travel writer Herodotus as a gift of the Nile. What he meant was, here in the Sahara Desert, there was this very thin strip of land, about 5 miles wide, about 400 miles long. And every year, this river, the Nile, would kind of flood up this layer of topsoil in which people could quickly farm grain. So all of the life of Egypt came from this one river. Egypt's life came from the Nile, but it could also be said that Egypt was a gift of the desert. The desert that surrounded Egypt made it impossible for centuries and centuries, impossible for anyone to get an army in to invade the country. The desert also protected Egypt from anyone getting out. So for us, the idea of slaves escaping from Egypt is something that we have heard about since childhood. But let's remember that the escape of slaves across the desert is considered the greatest miracle story in the Old Testament of the Bible. The desert protected Egypt. There is a story that the first people who learned how to predict the annual flooding of the Nile became the first kings of Egypt. The Nile would flood dependably once every 365.25 days. It flooded like clockwork. And for someone to figure out how to predict the flooding of the Nile gave them the aura of having a special relationship with the gods. As a matter of fact, if you could gather the people together and say, when I point at the Nile, it is going to flood, you could even claim to be a god yourself. This is how Egypt came to be a theocracy, a land of god kings, a place where the kings of Egypt could claim to have this supernatural, life-giving power, a power over, literally, life and death for all of the people of Egypt. Egypt as a theocracy, as a place where a human being could claim to have this godlike power. This is going to become very important as we study the story, the biblical story of the Exodus. The first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, it ends with the Hebrews becoming slaves in Egypt. How exactly does this happen? In the book of Genesis, a Hebrew named Joseph has been sold into slavery. He has been living in Egypt, and he begins to receive these messages from God, telling him that there will be 7 years of good harvests along the Nile, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph transmits this message to the Pharaoh, who listens to him and spends 7 years storing up extra food so that when the famine comes, Egypt has enough grain stored up to survive this 7 years of hardship. During this time, the Hebrews who have been living in Canaan land find themselves faced with this famine. And over time, they sell their livestock to Egypt in exchange for food. And finally, they are left with no choice but to sell their bodies, to sell themselves into slavery in Egypt, where there is enough food stored up to feed them. Hebrews are not kidnapped into slavery. They are not conquered. They are not taken into slavery by Egypt's weapons. They are not taken into slavery by Egypt's armies. They are taken into slavery by Egypt's stored food, Egypt's ability to feed them. It is Egypt's food that brings the Hebrews into slavery, and then it is Egypt's food that keeps them there. The book of Exodus begins with sometime later the coming of a new Pharaoh who does not remember Joseph, who does not remember this prophecy that saved Egypt from the famine. This new Pharaoh looks around and he sees that the Hebrews are actually doing very well in Egypt. Their population is growing to the point where this Pharaoh becomes concerned that if there is an uprising, if there is an invasion, that these Hebrews might join that and overthrow the kingdom. And so this Pharaoh begins to kind of put heavy tasks on the Hebrew people. He puts them into this forced labor. He makes their lives very difficult. And because he still feels threatened, he calls together the Hebrew midwives and he gives them this order. He says, if you find that you are delivering a son to one of the Hebrew women, put that son to death. If you find that you are delivering a daughter, you will let her live. The midwives we find in the book of Exodus disobey the Pharaoh's order. They begin hiding some of these boys away. One of the sons that is born among the Hebrews famously is Moses, and we have this very beautiful story about Moses's birth and how his mother is driven by these extreme conditions to do this very frightening thing. She puts him into a basket. Actually, the Hebrew word that is used is the same that is used for the ark with which Noah has rescued the animals in the book of Genesis. She puts the baby into this ark and puts the ark into the Nile. We can see this as an example of great faith. We can see this as an example of great desperation. But from the Nile, the baby is rescued by a daughter of the Pharaoh. Moses is the star of the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is largely going to center on this triangular relationship between God and Moses and Pharaoh. And yet, there's an old expression behind every great man is a great woman. And this is definitely true in the case of Moses. Behind him, even before he emerges as a character in the story, he is rescued by kind of this wonderful conspiracy of women. The first page of the book of Exodus is filled with these great heroes, the midwives who subvert the Pharaoh's order, the mother of Moses, the Pharaoh's daughter who adopts him. Without these political dissidents working against the Pharaoh on the first page of Exodus, we would not have the wonderful figure of Moses. We would not have the rest of the book. The first time that we see Moses acting for himself is a very strange story. I'll tell you, I was once reading a secondhand, a used commentary on the book of Exodus. And I got to this page, I turned the page, and somebody had crossed out a story with a magic marker, and they had written the word no with a big exclamation point in the margin. We're going to take a look at this troubling story. The first thing we see Moses do. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and he saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Looking at this story again, now in the year 2020, this is a story of police brutality. Moses goes out into the street. He witnesses an act of police brutality. He has grown up in a culture of violence. He has grown up in a dog-eat-dog Egyptian political world. Moses witnesses brutality. Nothing else seems to come into his mind except to meet that brutality with greater brutality. He sees police brutality, he kills the officer, he goes away. The next day, he's out walking, he sees two Hebrews fighting each other. He said to one of them, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" The guy answered, "Who made you the ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely this thing is known. And he fled and settled in the land of Midian. This story does not shine a very positive light on Moses. He is embarrassed by this thing. He gets called out in the street kind of for seeing bullying and becoming a bigger bully. Now the question is he going to keep bullying? Is he going to keep escalating this violence? The story is important. He is being looked at point blank, and he is being asked, when you see injustice, is this all that you've got to offer? If you see violence and respond with greater violence, how does that make you better than this Egyptian taskmaster? Moses seems to be so befuddled, so ashamed, so embarrassed. He can do nothing except for run away. In the desert, Moses once again sees injustice. He sees some shepherd women. They are drawing water at the well. There are these bullies who are chasing them around or pushing them away or being abusive toward them. Moses, once again, he drives the shepherds away. He seems to do this nonviolently. Now he seems to be looking at other ways of handling this. The story does not tell us that he used violence. It does not tell us that he killed these men. Moses, again, is seeing injustice. He does seem to be developing. And as a result, he is invited to come and live among the shepherds. He is invited into this family of shepherds, the story in which he marries into this family of shepherds. It is a powerful illustration that they recognize something in him. They recognize his power, his ability, and they invite him into something. In the Bible, being a shepherd, being willing to face the dangers of the wilderness and protect a flock of sheep, that is biblical shorthand for leadership. Moses is out there in the wilderness, and he is learning about leadership. He's learning about how to take care of people. This seems to be when God comes to recognize his personal growth, and he is going to be summoned. In the story of the burning bush, he is going to be summoned into a leadership role as someone who has what it takes to shepherd the people of Israel out of Egypt. From this time until the salvation of Egypt from the Hebrews from Egypt, Moses is not going to use violence again. He is going to become a prophet. He's going to become a spokesman for this God of liberation. The Israelites are groaning under their slavery. They are crying out. Their cry rises to God, and God sends them this new Moses, this Moses who is beginning to grow and mature. The book of Exodus presents Moses as an insider, somebody who knows the inner workings, somebody who is familiar with the Pharaoh, the workings, the politics of Egypt. He knows the Pharaoh, and he's going to be able to use this relationship to his advantage. But the Israelites themselves, the Hebrews, they do not trust him. And this is what is going to make it so important for him to establish these relationships with Aaron and Miriam, people who can translate for him, people who are trusted, people who are well known among the Hebrews. Something that's very important as we face the biblical book of Exodus is that Moses, the person, is very impressive. But he is going to get nowhere by himself. Moses is going to need to interact with Egypt, interact with the Pharaoh as part of a political movement. And this, no matter how big and charismatic he is, this is something he cannot do by himself. I think it's very significant that the people that he chooses to communicate between himself and the Hebrews are a man and a woman, male and female. God is going to communicate through him. He is going to need to be able to communicate through Aaron and Miriam. Moses and Aaron are going to go and see the Pharaoh. They're going to say those famous words, "Let my people go." But what they're actually asking for, their political demand in the first place, is not to leave Egypt forever. They're asking for 3 days to essentially have a religious revival, to have a tent revival in the wilderness. Actually, here we live in Western New York, which is very famous for its kind of religious camp revivals. This demand to go off and worship for 3 days in the wilderness. The Pharaoh is going to hear this, and immediately he is going to feel threatened by it. The Pharaoh is going to feel threatened by the idea of these Hebrews reconnecting with their roots, reconnecting with their pride, reconnecting with their ancestral stories and their ancestral God. So even though the Hebrews are requesting a 3-day campout and not a total exodus, the Pharaoh is going to perceive this as a threat. And the Pharaoh's response to this revival of Hebrew pride is he is going to seek to break this movement. His response is going to be to attempt to turn the Hebrews against each other, against their ancestral God, and against these political organizers who are stirring up this trouble. He's going to assign more work, more bricks, harder labor as a way to break up this movement. This introduces another important element in this story. As political organizers, Moses, Miriam, and Aaron must contend with the Pharaoh. They must contend with Egypt. They must also contend with the Hebrews themselves, who are going to come to them and say, "The Lord look upon you and judge. You have brought us into a bad odor with the Pharaoh and his officials. You have put a sword into their hand to kill us." The Pharaoh's strategy of breaking up this movement by turning the people against each other, we can see that this strategy is working very well. Fortunately, as we'll see, the Hebrew movement does have its own advantages. God is going to get actively involved. God is going to send these plagues against Egypt. Now, there's something really fascinating about these plagues. God is going to send a plague, Egypt is going to cry out, and then God is going to harden the heart of Pharaoh. God has determined that this full program must play itself out. Because the plagues are not just a message to the Pharaoh. I would say more importantly, the plagues are a message from God to the Hebrews. I think this brings up an important question in our current political situation. How can plagues inspire the oppressed to question current power structure? I encourage you now, just take a moment and sit with this question. How can a plague inspire the oppressed to question current power structures? I think we're seeing in our own time we've been seeing in the news, we've been seeing all summer, that when things get hard, when we face a crisis like a plague, we look to our leaders. A question on our mind. I mean, it puts our leadership to the test. It really gets us thinking again. How responsible is our leadership? How do we see that our leadership kind of cares about being a good shepherd to those people that our leaders are responsible for? And that's all I'm going to say about that. Some of these plagues have to do with food. When we look at the water turning into blood, when we look at the sickness that wipes out the cattle, when we look at the destruction of crops by flaming hail, when we look at the plague of locusts, God is speaking to the Hebrews. Let's remember, the Hebrews entered slavery because Egypt could feed them. The Hebrews stayed in slavery because Egypt could feed them. It was not the weapons, it was not the chariots, it was not the armies that kept the Hebrews in this position. It was the food that Egypt kept under lock and key. And here we have God challenging Pharaoh's reputation as a provider. God is challenging the idea, the belief in Pharaoh as that divine or semi-divine or so-called divine power that can feed you. God takes that away from the Pharaoh. And we can see gradually in the story, the Hebrews start to see the Pharaoh for what he really is. He's a naked emperor. He's a pretender on the throne. He does not have this power, this abundant power that he claims to have. So the 10 plagues, it might just look like a big fireworks display. It might just look like some big macho contest. Actually, there does seem to be a deeper message here. Hebrews' faith is growing. And we all know the story of how the Hebrews become liberated, the parting of the Red Sea. This is a very powerful image. It is a rebirth image. It is like a baptism image. The peoples who have been downtrodden, the peoples who have been enslaved, they pass through the waters again. They are symbolically reborn. The story of the parting of the Red Sea, very much like the story of God parting the waters in the book of Exodus. It is a whole new creation story. We may also note in this story, when Pharaoh has been kind of proven to be a failure as a god, a failure as a provider, God does not tell the Hebrews to kill him. God does not tell the Hebrews to take up arms and attack. It is God who does that. God parts the sea. The Pharaoh has the choice. The Pharaoh plunges through, kind of starts his way across anyway. And God punishes him for that. But Moses the prophet is not commanded to take on the Pharaoh with superior violence. God saves the Hebrews, and then something really interesting doesn't happen. God gives Moses the law, but God does not make him a king. This is really fascinating. This is one of the most fascinating things that does not happen in the entire Old Testament. Moses is like God's best friend in the Old Testament. He is fantastic. He's big. He and God are so close. But God does not lock up the food and give Moses the key. God gives Moses the law, but never makes him more than a prophet. By giving Moses the law, God retains that power for God's self. When we look at the law that is revealed through Moses, we can see that God becomes the king of Israel. This is pretty important because in the Egyptian system, the gods had a chosen person, the Pharaoh. And the only way to get in good with the gods was to work for Pharaoh. Now, the God of Israel is going to try this different experiment of having a chosen people and being equally accessible to all of the people in this community. This will not be a human social power pyramid. God has rescued the Hebrews from a pyramid like that. And what God is going to establish is a migratory tribal culture that is eventually going to become a tribal culture in Canaan, the land that we now know as Israel. God is going to hand down, actually, 613 commandments. But we won't be handling all of them tonight. We're going to do the greatest hits, the top 10, the 10 commandments. There's a lot of fine print. The 10 commandments are going to be God's way of protecting the community from exploitation by individuals. The first half of the 10 commandments are going to be, excuse me. There are many different ways to approach the 10 commandments. There are many different ways. I cannot say that one is more valid than another. This evening, in the context of this course, Prophets and Protest, we are going to be looking at the 10 commandments through a certain lens, in a certain way. I invite you this evening to look at the 10 commandments with me in this way, and then after I shut up, you can look at the 10 commandments in any way that you like, and I will never tell you that one way is better than another. But we're going to be looking at the 10 commandments this evening as a continuation of this protest against the kind of religious exploitation, economic, political exploitation that God rescued the people from in Egypt. We're going to look at this as a way of God protecting the Hebrews from building their own social pyramid and establishing their own version of Egypt. So we'll be looking first at the first half of the Ten Commandments, protecting God's people from religious exploitation, and then briefly at the second half of the commandments as a protection against economic exploitation. The first two commandments are about having other gods. The first one, you shall have no other gods before me. In other nations like Egypt and Babylon, in other nations, there would be multiple gods, a hierarchy of gods, corresponding with a hierarchy of human beings. The top gods being especially beholden to the top leaders. God here is saying that there will be no power pyramid of gods. Everyone will have equal access to one God. And in this way, God seems to be protecting by saying that there is no hierarchy of gods, then there can be no hierarchy of people. The second commandment is that there will not be an image of God. Obviously, if there is a statue, an image of God, it will not speak for itself. Someone else must speak for it. God will not allow someone else to set up an image and become the spokesman in that way. Oh my goodness, what have we here? Wow, you know, I recently found out the golden calf still around. Apparently, it can be found in Wall Street, USA. And not only that, but apparently, my New York State tax dollars have been paying for police officers to guard the golden calf. I'm kind of scandalized, and I'm a little bit concerned about this. All right. Anyway, but definitely, if you're ever on Wall Street, don't worship this thing. Okay. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. I've heard said, like if you drop a hammer on your foot and you say the name of God, you might burn in hell for all eternity. Maybe I am not God. No, here, what it's saying is that you will not use the name of God to gain political or economic power for yourself. This seems to be the kind of misuse of God's name that is being that the concern is about. Again, this commandment seems to be about protecting the community from religious exploitation. I've heard it said that the Ten Commandments are not the 10 suggestions. If that is how we feel, this next commandment is the most frightening of all. Observe the Sabbath day as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you do all your work. The Sabbath is for the Lord your God. Now, actually, interestingly enough, it says here, you shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or donkey, any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your towns, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. This commandment here to honor the Sabbath, this is one day in which everyone is equal. God demands that everyone from the top to the bottom, even the livestock, it is a day of equality. And it is not only a day of rest. There's a very important command here you will remember that you were a slave. It is a day of remembrance, a day of taking a look around and wondering, how, are we getting close to becoming Egypt again? And what can we do about it? And in case you're having trouble remembering the past, we have the next commandment. Honor your father and mother. These, the people in the community who really remember, the people who can look at the patterns, the people who can say, if you keep going that way, this is where you're going to end up. If you take this step now, somewhere down the line, you are going to become Egypt again. The people who keep the tradition. This commandment clearly is not intended to give one person the right to exploit or dominate or abuse someone else. I just don't believe that the God of Israel, who rescued the slaves from Pharaoh, would give even a parent that power over their own children. I believe it's a commandment that's there to really help people remember those traditions and to protect themselves from ending up on a destructive path. These commandments are about making sure that everyone in the community is going to have equal access to God. The second half of the Ten Commandments are more, we could say, kind of earthly. They're more community centered. They're there for basic community order, just to make sure that everyone will have their share, will have an honest chance to work and a chance to benefit from their own labor. We've been looking, I will answer questions. So just to quickly recap, we've been looking at the Exodus story as one of the most powerful stories ever shared. And my hope in this session is that we can look at it as a very powerful religious, spiritual story. I hope we can also look at it as a story that has certain political implications, maybe certain political, social messages that can help us to think about some issues that are going on in our own time.